All right. Thank you everyone for joining this week's SIG scheduling meeting. And let me share my screen. Today is only one item in the agenda. So Mike raised a very detailed, documented cap for simplified scheduler component config. So Mike, would you want to give a very short introduction on this and what's the motivation here?
Yeah, so I put together this cap for the problem that was brought up that's basically for anyone that's not aware, the framework, the scheduling framework right now has a number of extension points that are basically irrelevant to end users. So it's cluster administrators that are just trying to configure the scheduler. They're important for developers like pre-score and pre-filter to get that pre-processing stage, informational stage. But for users, if these are just required to start a certain plugin, they don't care about having that. They just want to be able to say, enable this plugin and everything that's required with it. So we wanted to add a way for users to do that simply. Just basically say, make this plugin work, enable every extension point that needs to go with it to make that certain work. So thinking about that, kind of ran into a number of questions that needed to be answered to how to do that. And the first thing that I hit was, how do we define what are the relevant extension points for a certain plugin? So, there needs to be some sort of mapping to say, if I've enabled this plugin, it is a pre-score, pre-filter, score, and filter plugin, which for in-tree plugins is easy enough for us to define in code. We can hard code that, but specifically for out-of-tree plugins, those really need a mechanism to be able to communicate to the framework easily that these are the relevant extension points for my plugin. And so the second thing to think about was, there's a request for how do we maybe configure disjoint sets of extension points. For some clusters, users might just want the filter plugin to run. They don't want the score plugins, but they still don't want to have to go and enable pre-filter and filter and then disable score. So there needs to be a way for users to configure that easily, but also, again, going back to the out-of-tree plugins, they need to be able to see that, provide the option to users, see that it's been set, and then communicate that back to the framework. And then finally, how do we do all of this in a way that's compatible with the existing framework and existing plugins, so that there's no code updates required for out-of-tree developers. No one's going to start, their code's not going to start breaking as soon as this is merged in. So what we came up with is a new extension point within the framework. Unlike the existing extension points, it isn't specifically part of the scheduling cycle, but I think that's okay because the framework itself is more than just the scheduling cycle. It's instantiating a scheduler and passing plugins to that. So this is, a instantiation extension point. And this addresses those three problems because it first off provides that communication mechanism for plugins to talk back to the framework through an interface, just like every other extension point. A user will implement this extension point function, just like they would implement score or pre-score or filter. And that having that pattern defined gives people, useful examples and makes it easy for us to document and provide to developers that want to add this if they desire to do so. For the second problem of the disjoint sets, if we're using an extension point, plugin arguments will still work just like they would for any other extension point function. So as these plugins are instantiated, users can use the existing plugin argument features that we have to say, perhaps I just want to provide a no scoring option for this. And that will be up to developers to determine if it's allowed as they'll have to implement into their register function, which is defined in the KEP more. But that gives a way to then communicate that back to the framework for out of tree plugins that we only want to set the filter plugins. So then the third thing, without breaking any existing code, adding a new extension point, any extension point in the framework is optional. Code isn't going to stop working because they don't implement this. There's no need to add any sort of nil functions or anything. You can use all the existing API types that are available. So there's nothing new that we need to define, or any sort of new structs that need to be passed around besides the new fields in the config API. So it's really a drop-in solution to the existing framework that it makes sense of the context of the framework. And it works really nicely with all of the existing functions that we have to, instantiate the current plugins. So that's an overview of it. As Wei is showing here, I have a lot more detail in the implementation plans, and I've gotten a lot of good questions from Abdullah and Wei and Aldo have been asking about why certain decisions I've made here. I think I've been able to get to a lot of them. If there's any other questions, or anyone would like to discuss some of the choices, I'm open to doing that. So yeah, that's what we have.
Yeah, thank you so much for driving this. I know it's necessary but complicated. Well, involves a lot of designs, especially you have to make the code compatible with the old config. So yeah, I gave some comments in the PR. In addition to those, I think I missed something that what's the future direction? So right now we have to make it compatible. Yes, that's true. So I missed one thing, is that what's the direction of that in the future? So that suppose we can dispose the current some config fields. So what's the direction? What's the ideal configuration like? I suppose that we can just get all the plugin which implement the multi-point extension as well, so as to make an ideal configuration there, right? So I think that part is missed on this cap. So what's the direction shape we'd like to see? But for now, for sure, we should make it compatible. There's a first question. The second question is, you mentioned that user can choose. The user means developers. The developer can choose to implement the multi-point interface or not. But if they choose to implement this, I suppose, I suppose that the configuration can still, for example, if a developer chooses to implement this multi-point interface. So in terms of configuration, they can still use the old way as well as the new way, right? So this is the second question.
Yeah, so that's totally right. I'm gonna start with that one. If a developer implements this into their plugin, because this is really just a convenience for end users that are using the plugin. So if they choose to implement that, then they can provide that to their end users. But if the end users still want to use the old config, they're free to do that. And we actually, you and I came up with a couple use cases in the discussion for where users might want to use the multi-point registration for a plugin and still have access to maybe disabling all of the default plugins that are in the cluster and only using their custom ones. Those are some examples that I could add to the KEP. So that is, yeah, these will play nicely together. it uses all of the current functions that we have for checking if a plugin is already registered. So it is actually pretty amazing how easily it drops in. For the first question, for the general direction of like the ideal config for this, I think that, what you're saying, if I understand, is at some point we try to migrate all of the plugins to using this multi-point and implementing it, and then eventually getting rid of the, the current config of having individual options. I'm not opposed to doing that eventually. I think that, like you were saying, the compatibility is a big part right now, so we don't want to take that step. But I think for all of the in-tree plugins, implementing this for each of those would be really trivial part of adding this, and would set a good precedent as the maintainers of the scheduler to be able to say, this is the direction that you should be taking as a plugin developer, and you should provide this to your users. And then as we gauge the adoption of it moving forward, I think that, trying to deprecate those older fields in favor of an ideal simplified user-facing config is definitely a good plan. But it's going to depend on usability or adoption, and the time between that versions that we can take to deprecate those existing fields.
Yes, why I ask this question is that to make this kind of two set of mechanisms work on the same time needs more maintenance efforts, right? So I think we can be more option to say, like, we like the ideal shape to sort of maybe in the future enforce people to use this multi-point only. And if you want to disable the portion of your plugins variants, like disable scoring, you can use some mechanism like using arguments or sort of to do that, so that we can ideally just remove all the score, filter all the fields. So my point is that we can be more option on this, and maybe well, also get some feedback from the user whether they are in favor of this.
Yeah, I think like I said, that's a good roadmap for it. I don't see why people wouldn't want to move forward, adopting the ideal pattern here, and then enforcing the multi-point registration would be as easy for us as just making it part of the core plugin interface if we wanted to be that strict about it, that people would need to update it at that point, probably when we remove those old fields. Users or developers would then have to update.
Yeah, and another comment from me is, because when I reviewed the cap, I was confusing on some combination of like in-tree regular versus multi-point plugin versus in-tree versus enable or disable. So I left a table. Maybe this is just something I can think of. Maybe you can add something. So this is the combination like in-tree plugin versus out-of-tree plugin, different options. So each directive, I think maybe we can come up with a table explaining the detailed semantics or motivations here, so people can better understand what's the overall picture looks like and which particular option they want to use to achieve a particular goal.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I hadn't seen this comment yet.
Okay, sure.
So, but seeing it now, I think that that's definitely something that should be fit into, because you brought up some good points about, some of these aren't clearly obvious what might happen, what are the semantics of each of these. I think that when you start to dig into them, they do have definitions already, but they're not obvious on the front. So having a table like this to clearly lay that out will definitely be a good improvement to the cap.
Yeah, right now we have maintained a list of 4 combinations. So in the future, if as I mentioned earlier, so if I can remove this, So we can only maintain multi-point extension point, then our life will be easier.
I have a few thoughts.
Sure.
So the first is, yeah, I think let's lay down what are the user stories. I think the main thing we want to support is simply someone wanting to enable an entire plugin, right? And another one is disabling a specific extension point, right? Yeah, and what else do we want to support? The disabled star today meant disable anything that was by default, right? Disable all the defaults for that extension point. Now it's a little bit unclear what it means, because if you enable a plugin, right, an entire plugin with a multi-point extension, then what does it mean if I have disabled score star? Does that disable the one you added with multi-point? Does that disable the score for multi-point or not? Yes,
Yeah.
so that will be, yeah, let's lay down all the user stories. And yeah, that table will help clarify what's the intention. What was the other point? Yes, so the other point is kind of what do we want to do in the future, right? Do we want to allow configuration through the multi-point and through the individual points forever, or not? If not, I guess we'll be requiring the plugin developers to have a configuration for disabling specific functionality. But if we are already doing this multi-point plus single points, why? Maybe it's not worth. Maybe we can just keep supporting this use case this way. And my last thought is I don't really see. It's kind of related to the previous point. I don't really see the need for register function, right? If we can already detect which points are implemented, so why add the extra burden to developers? If the intention is to be able to disable specific extension points, then again we go back to the question: do we want to support that through having all the extension points in the configuration, or through an argument? But even if it is through an argument, we still have other alternatives, right?
Right. So the point of the register function is more than just providing that configuration. It's a necessary way for the plugin to define its mapping for what extension points to register to, because like you said, we can't just determine which ones are available for it, but using the existing plugin instantiation functions that we have through there. I have some code samples in the CAP that show, I think it's like update plugins list. Yeah, right up there, that update plugins list function, when it's passed a plugin set, that e.plugins parameter is usually just the main profile plugin set. But if you pass it a specific plugin set, it will only try to match to those. So it kind of, it's not a hack. It's using it exactly how it's defined, to then we can map these plugins to their registerable types. And if anything is misconfigured there, or a wrong configuration is coming from the plugin, an error will be raised like it is now if you have a plugin misconfigured. So it's not just like a nice configuration or a feature thing, it's actually like a core part of the proposal that we need to have a way to define this.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not necessary that we pass the multi-point through this loop. We can do it. We can do it separately.
Yeah, but I mean, what other way do you have where an out of tree plugin can say that these extension points are the ones that I want to register for?
We just iterate through all the interfaces that we know, and if the plugin implements it, then it's enabled.
So the problem with that is that we lose error checking, which we currently have that says, you know, if you have a plugin misconfigured, it says an error. This does not implement that type. I think that that's important to have. And I think that
I'm not convinced, because the error is precisely because, okay, I want to enable reserve for this plugin, and this plugin doesn't implement reserve. Right, but now we are going towards simplifying. So then the user doesn't care about what the extension points are. The user just want to enable the entire plugin. So there is no need for error checking, in my opinion.
that is a good point. You know, if we get rid of the other fields and there's no other config available, then we can go through that extension point. But I think until we deprecate the existing fields, that should still be there.
No, I mean, it doesn't have to be. We can keep doing the error checking for the individual fields, but for multi-point, we don't go through this process. Yeah, it would be.
You do the error checking after you unroll the multi-point.
Right.
Those would pass for the multi-point anyways, because we already checked them, but for the ones that are specified explicitly, they will get the error checking done on them properly.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that can work for, I think that then you do still have the, the issue of passing a way to register for specific points, like disabling the score. Would that still be able to work with that?
I think so, right? If we keep the individual ones, you could say like enable pod topology spread multi-point, and then in score we disable the same one. So it means, okay, we want everything but the score.
But what about for out of tree plugins? Because disabled doesn't have any effect on out of tree.
Well, we could change that, right? That's why, yeah, we could clarify what's the new interpretation of disabled.
Yeah, so that's a change to the existing semantics of disabled, though.
That is fine, because we're doing a new V1 beta 3. So if we think that this is the right way, that's not a problem. I think, I mean, that was a good discussion about like, how do we actually implement this? But I would focus in the first round on the API. Let's get that like really properly done with all the semantics flushed out. How defaulting is going to work in general for these plugins. Like for when you specify multi-point, how default? Yeah, I think we discussed it on the CAP. And then we make sure that this API, how to implement this API using whatever explicitly register or not, and we just iterate over the interfaces of the plugin struct and check them. I think this is more implementation details.
Yeah, like we went over, like API defaulting and stuff is something that we still have control over. That's relevant for in-tree plugins. So that's just the same. We would basically update our set of default plugins to just use multi-point. And we can set the weights through that because plugin weights for score plugins are still available through plugin set.
Right.
So that's a type that we get for free.
One thing that is going to be good with the like getting rid of the register function is that the defaulting is going to be hard coded by us, so they don't really need to do it for the weight. So in component config defaulting logic, we set the weight for the score plugin, the default weight, for example, 1, but we need to propagate that to the score plugin right when we unroll it. And if you have an explicit register function, then each plugin has to do that explicitly, and this is a source of error. So in every plugin, you need to do that.
No, a plugin doesn't have to. For defaulting, an out-of-tree plugin could do that if they wanted to provide a default weight, but plugins still don't need to provide.
I'm talking about in-tree.
Yeah, I know. In-tree, if we define in-tree just like we have under, I think it's our default plugins in the API, we have the weights defined for score there. If we just move those weights up to the new multi-point extension, I can add an example of this into the cap if it might be more helpful. That will be unrolled.
If the user wants to configure the multi-point weight, the register function still needs to grab that field and copy it to the score.
Now the register function doesn't handle weights. That's handled by the current parsing of where we get extension points, and then we update plugin list. That's where the weight is handled.
So I guess that would be another thing to look up. Do we want to have multi-points weight affect something? I think we should make it affect the score.
I'll add an example of what effect this would have on our API defaulting, because it really it just translates one-to-one. It doesn't have any effect with the register function at all. So that example right there, multi-point pot-to-tree spread weight. This is basically what our defaulting API could look like, and that will get translated right to our function where it gets unrolled.
But I think, this 3 needs to be copied to the score, right?
It will be so each of them will implement a register function that says score, my function name, and then the weight from this argument will be copied when it calls.
Right. So that's what we are saying. Like that could be a source of errors. That what if someone forgets to copy this into the score?
Well, someone doesn't need to forget to copy it. If it's set in multi-point, it will get copied by how the framework works.
Okay, so you're saying after the not at the register function, after the register function, after you call the register, you're going to force copying the multi-point weight into the score.
Yeah, so these are just the plugin API type, same one that we have already. So the same way that it copies the weights now for functions that are specifically in the score will be the exact same method that it takes for setting the weights in multi-point plugins, because this type doesn't matter if this type is in multi-point, whether it's in score or something, until it's actually like cast to an interface, it's usable by any of them. So it will register, will copy all of this information, name and weight, into the score list. And then I believe in the code below that, we actually go through and parse the score functions and set their weights into the score weight map in that section of code.
Right, but then if someone sets the weight in the register function, and then they will be surprised later that it will be overridden by the multi-point one. That's a minor thing, but it's like...
Yeah, if someone sets the weight in the register function, that's on the developer of the register function.
But it's going to have no meaning, right?
It would have no meaning, right?
Mm-hmm.
We could set it to have a meaning. If out of tree developers want to set a default weight for their plugin, then we could parse that. I included the weight in the register function here, but after Abdullah brought that point up in the discussion, I don't think that I should have the weight in my register example, which is lower down. Right here, it makes sense in the multi-point.
Okay. What could still be a source of errors is simply we add a new extension point to a plugin and then we forget to update the register. So yeah, I think in general there are a few things that make the register non-desirable, and also like everybody needs to implement it, right? So it would be better if out of tree plugins can directly benefit. They don't need to change anything, and they already can support multi-point. So I think there are pros and cons, and from my perspective, the cons are higher.
Yeah. I also, when I started looking into the CAB, I also have exactly same concern with Aldo. And I think making a paragraph to explaining the pros and cons can make the readers better understanding why we need that register explicitly, especially that you mentioned it's optional right now. So what's the benefits there to have it implemented versus not, and how it impacts with our future ideal shape of how the plugin config looks like. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll add a pros and cons breakdown. I think we've had some good points brought up here.
So right now it's like we have two ways to get a multi-point plugin registered into the particular extension point. One is versus the YAML versus the static configuration. The other way is for the programmatic way to implement this. So how maybe they can conflict, and what's our opinion on this, and how we can guide the user to use a static way versus a programmatic way. So that's the thing we need to think about. Yeah, I think overall it's in a good shape that the multi-point. The idea, I buy in this idea, just some even details and how, whether we need this interface or not, and what's the specific schematics, like I mentioned earlier in the table, need to figure out. So yeah, we can spend some time here, then this can buy us later in the future, the confusion maybe in the user side. How about that? And any other comments on this? And if you have some specific comment, you can raise up in the PR right here. And seems there's no other items in the agenda. So if you have anyone, you can just raise up. If not, I will stop the recording, and you can always find us on the Slack. Okay.
Hi, folks. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm the 123 release lead, and just wanted to put the link for opt-in for enhancements in the chat here. I did see that this SIG talked about the features that they are going to be planning for 123 in the last meeting. So I'll just put that in the Slack chat. Yeah, just under the CAP collection there.
Yeah. So instead, we need to fit in the specific cap name we plan for the 123 release.
Yeah, under the cap collection tab, which it's the fourth one, you just add in the enhancements issue number.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you select the one on the cap collection, I don't know if that's selected on your side.
Okay,
Yep.
a second. The
One,
zoom.
one to the right.
Yeah. I know. Just the
Oh,
zoom,
gotcha.
the bottom bar just covered.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, just add in the enhancement issue number, the name, the signee, the SIG, and
Okay.
if it needs docs, and if it requires any updates to the documentation websites, and also just the link to the cap.
Okay. Sure, we will do that. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. Yeah, basically, I don't see there's any feature we need to track, but yeah, I can discuss with Aldo and Abdullah later. If we have some, we'll fill in the table. Yeah, thank you, Ray.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, I think I can stop. Yeah, and yeah, thank you everyone for joining today's meeting. We will see you in 2 weeks, and have a nice day.
Thank
Yep,
you.
thanks.